So it sounds like a good segue to come to our second question. Your work at Berkeley, it sounds, in a sense, you've come full circle from, let's say, a very practical experience of religion in your youth, more international exposure to different religious climates, different religious conflict, more philosophical, intellectual look at religion in your undergrad and MA. And then you arrive at Berkeley for your PhD here. Could you walk us quickly through your PhD work and then maybe give us a quick summary of your dissertation, the key points, where it fits into the wider research?
Sure. Yeah, that's a better summary of my journey than I gave. That's great. Yeah. So when I was looking at graduate schools, religion was, again, new on the agenda in political science. There weren't many programs that, many universities that yet had institutes like the Berkeley Center for the Study of Religion and that have now developed at other universities. So I looked for faculty. I looked at who was publishing and researching on religion and conflict, and who seemed particularly invested in it, because there was obviously a uptick in research after 9/11.
Sure.
And there are some people who published shortly after that who've never published on religion again. And they made a useful contribution, but it was clear it wasn't their main focus. So the attraction at Berkeley was Ron Hassner, who not just in what he was publishing, but also his personal correspondence when I applied and when I visited, made it clear that this was his area. Awesome. This is what he would be studying for at least 10 years. His next project was still on religion. And I think we shared a lot of ideas about how religion influences social and political behavior. So when I got to Berkeley, though, he gave really good advice, which was first learn everything you can about political science.
Really?
Then if you want to do religion in political science, to convince our colleagues that you sort of have a place at the table, first show them that you kind of know the materialist side of political science. At the same time, he did encourage me to take classes outside our department.
Sure.
And that was helpful. It also helped that I had done a master's at Georgetown, where I took a lot of classes on religion. For example, with Jose Casanova, great sociologist of religion, right? Happened to be there. So I spent the first couple of years really focusing on political science, particularly since I was newish to the discipline, starting to branch out and make contacts in other departments, going to talks. And then that really helped me develop the dissertation project, which looks at how states respond to religious insurgencies. It's a project not about how religion fuels conflict. It's actually not a project even on a scholarly definition of religion or religion per se. I'm interested, and this is where I think the political science background helped, I'm really interested in how decision makers perceive opponents that draw on religion.
Okay, let me intervene real quick just to give you credit and some publicity. The title of your dissertation, The Cult of Coercion, Religion and Strategic Culture in British Counterinsurgency. So maybe you could also give us a little background on the title and why Britain, and what do you find in terms of the strategic culture, counterinsurgency, and how they interact with religion?
Great, yeah. I need to learn publicity.
Hey.
So the title came last,
of course,
with all dissertations.
Yes.
The dissertation did start, so the original idea for my research was to look at how religion did influence the behavior of rebels and insurgents. And as I researched it, quickly became overwhelmed by just how many people focused on that. And it still is a valuable contribution, but with a dissertation, you kind of want to make people look a different direction. Sure. And so that's where I decided to look, instead of how religion motivates rebels, how perceptions of religion influence decision making, and I stumbled upon these British cases in a way.
Elaborate, please.
Again, because I'm interested in contemporary conflict and I'd like my work to speak to what's happening today. I started with contemporary cases, thought about going to the Philippines and other places where conflict had been going on for decades, and so at least people would be willing to talk. There might be some information. But even that information, because the conflict is ongoing, is well guarded. And it was more out of despair, right? A round of failed grants that I started to think more broadly. I was talking to Ron, and he mentioned Cyprus sort of offhanded during a meeting, and so I started looking at it more. Of course, this now turns out to be the conflict that is one of, I think, the most interesting in the dissertation, because it's an insurgency in which the Archbishop of the Cypriot Orthodox Church founds and funds the movement, helps organize it, but I didn't know that at the time.
Okay.
But as I read more into these cases, I said, well, what else is going on around this time? With sort of the methodology in the back of my head that it's nice to have a set of cases that happen around the same time, the same government. And then it turns out, right, in the late 40s, there's a Jewish insurgency in mandatory Palestine, involves secular, most of the time you read about it, you hear about secular Zionists, but there's a small religious Zionist group that also participated. And then I started looking at Kenya, which happens at the same time, the Mau Mau uprising, which again, a lot of people, when you read about it, focus on the ethnic side.
Yeah.
But there's an overlap with ethnicity and religion. And when I went into the archives, there's a clear connection for the British. So there are cases that I stumbled upon and said, wow, I really like reading about these cases. And isn't it great that methodologically it helps, that they're all happening around the same time, same government, same military force. And in fact, for example, the governor of Cyprus also advises on the Kenya emergency. So when I want to look at how these decision makers are evaluating the conflicts, I'm not looking at just sort of random people or ad hoc. I'm looking at sort of a community, so what ends up being a security community, and that's why I focus on strategic culture. Strategic cultures are these sets of ideas and beliefs that militaries and political decision makers hold that can influence the way they see violence.
Okay, so let me ask a somewhat naive question. Maybe you can help walk us through it. The cult of coercion, is the cult there these decision makers, the strategic culture?
Yeah. So it's a play on an international relations concept, the cult of the offensive.
Okay.
Which is a study by a Berkeley PhD in the 80s, and then others have looked at it. But it's this idea that during the world wars, that there was a heavy emphasis on an interstate conflict to favor offensive versus defensive. And it became a whole theory in international relations about you could predict the likelihood of war in any given time period based on whether offensive weapons or defensive weapons were more prominent. Okay. But for me, what I was interested in is this convergence. When I started thinking theoretically, well, first I had to think about, well, how do decision makers evaluate the religious dynamics of their opponents? Do they? Some people would say they don't, if you look at the American context in Iraq, but they do. There's in other cases. And then when they do, how does that influence them? And what I was seeing and what I developed as a theory is that this idea that it predisposes them towards coercion rather than negotiation. Okay. Because the big puzzle in the dissertation in the end is looking at why religious conflicts are so intractable. And the argument here is that state decision makers also play a role in the protracted nature of these conflicts. It's not just insurgents. So the call to the coercion is a nod towards this idea that decision makers, because of the way they interpret the motivations of their opponents, choose to favor coercion rather than negotiated